She had stopped believing that she was meant to be seen, not because she wanted to stop believing it, but because life had gently, repeatedly, and quietly taught her that expectation was a form of self-harm when it had nowhere to land. So she learned a different way of existing, not disappearing, just not being remembered. The settlement of the pack was alive in ways that never included her. It breathed with direction, with purpose, with names that carried weight. Warriors were acknowledged. Healers were respected. Elders were listened to. Even children had voices that sometimes echoed further than they should. But she moved through it like something between a thought and a shadow, present enough to function, not important enough to hold. Every morning, she woke before the sun fully gathered strength over the horizon. The air was always cold at that hour, as if the world itself was still deciding whether it wanted to begin another day. She would step out quietly, careful not to disturb the rhythm of the place, and begin her tasks. Water first, always water, heavy buckets that pulled slightly at her arms, reminding her body that it still existed in a physical world, even if the emotional one had long stopped acknowledging her. Then herbs, then healing quarters, then whatever small thing someone had decided was beneath their attention. She never complained, not because she was strong in the way others admired, but because she had learned that complaints were only heard when someone already cared, and no one had ever cared enough to begin with. The healing quarters were her only consistent space, a place where pain was allowed to exist without needing permission. Broken bones, fevered breaths, wounded wolves, everything arrived here eventually, stripped of pride and status. Pain made everyone equal, at least for a moment. She moved through the space with practiced calm, her fingers already familiar with the texture of herbs, the smell of dried bark, the faint metallic trace of blood that never fully left the wooden tables no matter how much they were cleaned. A wounded wolf lay on one of the cots today, not dying, not thriving, somewhere in between. She approached him quietly. His eyes flickered open slightly as she sat beside him. "You're still here," she murmured softly, almost as if speaking to herself. The wolf gave a faint exhale. She checked the bandages, tightening them just enough to support but not disturb. Her movements were careful, almost gentle in a way that came from repetition, not sentiment. "You'll heal slower if you keep shifting like that," she added, her tone mildly amused. The wolf didn't respond, but his breathing eased again. Moments like this were simple, predictable, safe, and in her world, safety was the closest thing to peace. Behind her, the tent entrance shifted. Someone entered without announcement. She didn't turn immediately. She already knew the pattern of it. Not every presence in her life needed acknowledgement because most of them never waited for it anyway. "Those herbs need to be delivered to the central storage," a voice said flatly. "I already sent them," she replied without looking back. A pause. Then footsteps moved past her, no thanks, no recognition, not even curiosity. Just the sound of someone passing through a space that did not require them to notice the person maintaining it. When the footsteps faded, she finally exhaled softly, not out of sadness, not out of anger, just habit. There were days when she wondered if invisibility was something people could learn to survive so well that it eventually replaced identity. On those days, she stopped wondering quickly, because questions had a dangerous habit of expecting answers, and answers were never kind to her. Outside, the settlement was shifting into its daytime rhythm. She could hear it faintly, voices growing stronger, training sounds from distant grounds. The occasional call of someone giving instruction. Life continued, just not with her in it. She stepped outside briefly to gather more water. The sky was pale, not yet fully awake. Light spread unevenly across the land, touching some areas with warmth and leaving others untouched. She paused for a moment near the edge of the path. A breeze passed. It carried something unfamiliar. Not scent, not sound, something closer to awareness, as if the world had briefly looked up. She frowned slightly, adjusting the strap on her shoulder. Something felt unsettled, not dangerous in a way she could define, but different. She continued walking. The feeling followed her anyway. By midday, she had almost forgotten it. Almost. The healing quarters grew busier. A minor skirmish had left several injured wolves in need of attention. She worked steadily, moving from one patient to another, her hands never rushing even when the demands increased. A young warrior groaned softly as she applied a salve to his wound. "Hold still," she said gently. "You'll make it worse." "I didn't think I'd lose that fight," he muttered. "You didn't lose," she replied. "You just didn't win." A faint, tired laugh escaped him. It was small, but it existed, and for reasons she did not analyze. That mattered. As the sun began to lower slightly, shadows stretched longer across the ground outside, and then silence changed. It was not sudden. It was not loud. It was subtle, like the world inhaling and forgetting to exhale. She noticed it first. In the animals, a distant wolf stopped moving. Birds shifted direction. Even the wounded warrior beside her fell quiet. She slowly straightened. "What is that?" Someone outside muttered. Another voice answered, lower, "Don't ask." That alone made her stomach tighten slightly. She stepped toward the entrance of the healing tent. The air outside felt different, heavier, not oppressive, just aware, as if it was waiting for something to pass through it. People were moving, but not normally. Conversations were shorter. Steps were faster. Eyes were scanning the distance more than usual. Something was coming, or already here. She tightened her grip on the edge of the tent flap, then released it slowly. No one had called her name. No one had warned her. That was normal. She stepped outside. The settlement looked the same at first glance, but if you looked carefully enough, you could see it. The tension hidden in posture, the subtle shift of guards toward the outer pots, the way even elders had stopped speaking mid-sentence more often than usual. Something had changed, and no one was explaining it. She walked slowly, unsure why she was even moving forward instead of staying inside. Then she saw him, at first, just a small figure near the outer path. A child. He stood alone, which should not have been possible. Children in pack territory were never alone without reason, never unguarded, never unnoticed. She frowned slightly and stepped closer. "Hey," she called gently, keeping her voice soft so as not to startle him. "Are you lost?" The boy turned, and the moment his eyes met hers, something paused inside her. Not fear, not recognition, something quieter, like memory without a past. He studied her carefully, too carefully, as if deciding something that had already been decided long ago. "I'm not lost," he said. His voice was calm and controlled, too calm for his age. She softened her expression slightly. "Where are your guardians?" A brief pause. Then he walked toward her, no hesitation, no fear, just certainty. "I found you," he said instead of answering. That made her still slightly. "Found me," she repeated softly. He nodded once, then stopped a few steps away. Up close, she could see the fine details of him now, the quality of his clothing, the subtle markings on fabric that did not belong to ordinary families, the way his posture held itself with quiet awareness. He was not just a child. He was something protected, something important. I need to ask you something, he said. Her expression softened further, instinctively. All right. He tilted his head slightly, studying her face as if confirming she was real. Then he asked, very simply, will you marry me? The world did not stop, but it changed. It shifted in a way that made everything else feel slightly distant, as if sound and motion had been pulled back just enough for that one sentence to exist alone. She blinked once, then again, not because she didn't understand, but because she did not understand why a child would carry such words. She slowly lowered herself to his level, crouching so they were eye to eye. That is a very serious question, she said gently. Who told you to say that? No one, he replied immediately. His honesty was unsettling in its simplicity. I just need someone who stays. Something in her chest tightened, quietly, carefully, like something old inside her had shifted its weight. She studied him more closely now. There was loneliness in him. Not loud, not dramatic, but deeply settled. The kind that did not come from a moment, it came from time. You don't understand what marriage means, she said softly. I understand. I don't want to be alone, he answered in silence. The world around them continued, but it felt further away now. She should have laughed softly. She should have corrected him and walked away. That would have been normal, safe, expected. But something about the way he said it made her heart hesitate, because it did not feel like a game. It felt like a request made by someone who had already been waiting too long. She exhaled slowly. If it makes you feel less alone, she said gently, then yes. The boy stared at her for a long moment, then nodded once. Good, he said, and just like that, something settled in him, as if her answer had closed a space inside his small world. She stood slowly, unsure why her own chest felt slightly heavier. Now, where are your parents? She asked again, softer this time. But before he could answer, the air changed again, this time. Deeper, heavier, not silence. Presence. Something vast moving closer without needing sound. The boy did not turn, but his hand moved slightly closer to her sleeve, not fear, a choice. She felt it before she saw it. The settlement itself seemed to shift. People slowing, voices fading. Even the wind seemed unsure whether to continue. Then footsteps, measured, controlled, unhurried. Approaching, she turned and saw the world parting. Not physically, but instinctively. Guards stepping aside, without command. Elders lowering their gaze without instruction. Even the air itself seemed to recognize something arriving that did not need introduction. And then he appeared. The world did not announce his arrival with noise. It announced it with absence, as if every sound that should have existed decided, at once, to step back and give him space. She noticed it first in the boy beside her. His small fingers, which had been resting near her sleeve, tightened slightly, not in fear exactly, but in recognition. Like something inside him had shifted from innocence into awareness. The Alpha King stood at the edge of the path. He did not move quickly. He did not need to. Every step he took carried a stillness that made the air feel arranged, rather than disturbed. His presence did not push the world aside, it made the world reorganize itself around him. Guards who had moments ago been speaking now stood silent. Elders lowered their eyes not from obedience alone, but from instinct. Even the wind seemed to hesitate, and yet his expression was not harsh. It was controlled, measured, almost quiet. His gaze moved once across the settlement, then stopped, on the boy, and then on her. Something inside her chest tightened in a way she could not explain. Not fear, not awe, something closer to being seen to. Clearly, after a lifetime of being ignored, the boy stepped slightly behind her, not hiding, but choosing. That small movement changed everything she thought she understood about the moment. The Alpha King's voice came finally, calm, deep, unshaken. "Step away from my son." The words were not raised, but they carried weight that did not require volume. She inhaled slowly. "Son," the words settled in her mind like something heavy being placed down carefully. Her eyes flicked briefly toward the boy. He did not look guilty. He did not look afraid. He looked still, as if this moment had already been expected. She slowly turned back to the man before her. "I did not know he was your son," she said quietly. "I know," he replied. That simple acknowledgement should have calmed her, but it didn't, because there was something in his tone that suggested he already understood more than what she had said, more than what she herself understood. Silence stretched between them, not empty, heavy with meaning. Neither of them had spoken yet. The boy stepped out from behind her again, as if unwilling to let distance form too naturally. "I asked her," he said softly. The Alpha King's gaze shifted slightly downward. Not anger, not approval, just attention. "What did you ask?" he asked. The boy hesitated only a moment, then answered with the same innocent certainty that had already changed her life once. "I asked her to marry me." The silence that followed this time felt different, not just heavy, but layered, like the entire settlement had paused to listen more closely without moving closer. She felt her throat tighten slightly. That sentence, spoken aloud in front of him, suddenly carried a weight she had not fully understood before. It was no longer a child's question. It had become a statement that now existed in a larger world. The Alpha King did not react immediately. He looked at his son for a long moment, then at her again, not judging, not accusing, observing carefully, as if trying to understand what chain of events had led here. "You do not understand what you are asking for," he said finally, softly. The boy shook his head. "I understand. I don't want to be alone." Something flickered in the Alpha King's eyes then. Not emotion that broke control, but something quieter, recognition. He understood that sentence more than anyone else in that space. For a moment, something passed through his expression that no one else would have noticed, unless they were watching closely. Then it was gone again. He controlled, he contained. He stepped forward once, not toward her directly, but closer to the space between them. The world around him did not resist, it simply allowed. And now she could see him more clearly. Not just the Alpha King, but a man who had carried something heavy for a long time without letting it fall. His gaze returned to her. "You are the one he chose to approach?" he asked. The phrasing surprised her slightly, not accusation, not disbelief, just question. "Yes," she answered carefully. A pause. Then she added, softer, "He came to me on his own." The Alpha King studied her face again, longer this time. Not in the way others looked at her, not dismissing, not overlooking, but noticing, as if she were something that had not been properly placed in the world yet. The boy tugged lightly at her sleeve again, a small gesture, but it anchored something strange in her chest. The Alpha King noticed it. His gaze dropped briefly to that connection, then returned to her. "You are from the healing quarters," he said. It was not a question. She nodded slightly. "Yes." Another pause, then, unexpectedly, he said, "You should not be here." Her fingers tightened slightly at her side. That sentence should have felt like rejection, but it did not, because his tone did not carry dismissal, it carried observation, as if he was stating something that had been placed incorrectly in the world. I have always been here, she replied quietly. Something subtle shifted in his expression at that, not surprise, not correction, but understanding. And that understanding made her feel slightly more exposed than anything else so far. The boy looked between them, then spoke again. She said yes. The Alpha King's eyes moved back to her instantly. Yes, he repeated. Her breath caught slightly. I did not understand the question fully, she said carefully. He asked in a child's way. I responded in kindness. The Alpha King did not respond immediately. Instead, he looked at his son again, then back at her. There was no anger in him, no sudden judgment, but there was something else forming, a quiet awareness that something had been set in motion without intention. You gave an answer, he said finally, not a question, a recognition. Yes, she admitted softly. Silence again, but this time it felt different, not tense, not dangerous, just uncertain, as if the world itself had not decided yet what this meant. The boy smiled faintly, as if satisfied by something only he understood. The Alpha King noticed that too. His gaze softened by the smallest degree. Then he made a decision. Come, he said simply. One word, directed not at her as command, but as direction. She hesitated, not out of defiance, but confusion. Where? She asked. To speak, he replied. The boy immediately stepped closer to her again, as if unwilling to separate from the person who had answered him. The Alpha King noticed that too, and for a brief moment, something unreadable crossed his face. Then he turned slightly. The world shifted with him. Guards adjusted positions. People stepped aside. Not rushed, not afraid, just instinctive alignment. She realized something then. This was not a man who forced space. This was a man who existed in space that others adjusted to. And somehow, she had been standing directly inside that space without understanding it. They walked, not quickly, not dramatically, but steadily. The boy stayed beside her. The Alpha King walked slightly ahead, but not so far that it felt like separation, and the entire settlement watched in silence as if unsure whether they were witnessing a moment or the beginning of something larger. She became aware of small details as they moved, the way no one dared interrupt their path, the way even conversation resumed only after they passed, the way her existence so often ignored was now being noticed in a way that felt almost unfamiliar. They reached a quieter structure near the inner grounds. Not a hall, not a public space, somewhere private. The Alpha King stopped, then finally turned fully toward her. You did not refuse him, he said. It was not judgment, it was clarification. She nodded slightly. I did not think it was a serious request. And now? He asked. That question made her pause, because now she understood enough to know it was not simple anymore. I understand it is not what I thought, she admitted. The boy looked up at her then, as if waiting, as if her answer still mattered in a way she had not yet realized. The Alpha King studied her again, not as a stranger anymore, but as something newly placed in his awareness. You are not from noble blood, he said quietly. No, she answered. A pause. Then, softer, I am no one important. That sentence should have closed the conversation, but it did not, because something in his expression changed slightly at that, as if he did not agree with how she defined herself. But he did not correct her either. Instead, he said something unexpected. He trusts you. Her breath caught slightly. She looked at the boy. He nodded once, simple, certain. The Alpha King's gaze remained on her. Trust from his son was not a small thing. She could feel that without being told. And yet she did not know what she had done to earn it. I did not intend for anything, she said quietly. I know, he replied again. That repeated acknowledgement unsettled her more than anything else, because he seemed to understand her without needing her to explain. A silence settled between them, not uncomfortable, but full. Then the Alpha King spoke again, softer than before. Stay here for now. It was not a command. It was a decision made in consideration. For what purpose? She asked carefully. To understand what happened, he said. The boy reached for her hand again. This time she did not move away. The Alpha King noticed, and for the first time, something in his expression lingered a little longer than before. Not emotion, not reaction, but awareness. Something had already begun, and none of them had chosen it fully yet. She did not realize at first that staying would feel heavier than leaving. Not physically, but in the quiet way presence changes when it is no longer temporary. The room they brought her to was not a prison, nor a cage, nor anything that carried the language of punishment. It was calm, simple, clean in a way that felt almost unfamiliar to her eyes. But still, she stood near the center of it as if unsure whether she was allowed to fully exist there. The boy had not left her side. He sat now on a low bench near the window, watching her with the same steady certainty he had carried since the beginning, as if her presence was no longer a question he needed to solve, but a fact he had already accepted. The Alpha King had left them there with only one final instruction. Stay. No one will disturb you. And then he was gone. No explanation, no pressure. Only space. But space, she was learning, could be its own kind of weight when it belonged to someone like him. Hours passed in a strange kind of silence. Not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of something paused mid-breath. The boy eventually fell asleep where he sat, his head tilted slightly to one side. She noticed it only when his breathing changed, becoming softer, more uneven in that way children breathe when they are no longer holding themselves together. Through awareness, she moved slowly, almost instinctively, and adjusted a small cloth near him so he would not feel cold. He did not wake. That small trust unsettled her more than anything else, because trust was something she had never been asked to hold. She stood there for a moment longer, watching him, and then she realized something quietly uncomfortable. He had not treated her like someone temporary, not even once. A soft knock came at the door. She turned slightly. An elder healer entered. Not rushed, not alarmed, just observant. He was older than most in the settlement, his presence carrying the calm weight of someone who had seen enough to understand when not to interfere too quickly. His eyes moved first to the boy, then to her, then lingered slightly longer. You were brought here by the Alpha King, he said gently. It was not a question. She nodded slowly. Yes. A pause. Then he stepped inside fully, closing the distance without urgency. That alone does not happen without reason, he continued. I did not ask for it, she replied quietly. I did not say you did, he said. That response made her silence deepen slightly. The elder looked at her for a moment longer, then softened his tone. You are not from the noble line, he said carefully. I know, she answered. And yet, he added, you are here. She did not respond, because she did not know how. The elder's gaze moved again to the boy. Do you know who he is? He asked softly. Yes, she said. A pause. Now I do. The elder nodded slowly. as if that answer confirmed something he had already suspected. Then you also understand, he said, that nothing around him happens by chance. That word stayed in her mind longer than expected. Chance. She looked at the boy again, sleeping, calm, unaware of how far his simple question had already moved the world around him. I only answered him, she said quietly. The elder gave a faint, almost sad smile. That is how most irreversible things begin, he replied. Silence followed, not heavy, but thoughtful. Then the elder stepped closer, lowering his voice slightly. The Alpha King will not react without understanding, he said. But understand this, he does not ignore patterns. She looked at him. What pattern? She asked softly. The elder did not answer immediately. Instead, he studied her expression carefully, then said, a child does not approach a stranger with that level of certainty unless something inside him recognizes safety. Her breath slowed slightly. That is not possible, she said. Not impossible, he corrected gently. Just uncommon. The weight of that settled slowly in her chest. She had always believed her existence was simple, invisible, unremarkable. But now that belief was beginning to feel like something fragile, no longer stable enough to stand on. The elder turned toward the door again. He will come for you again, he said before leaving. For me, she repeated quietly. But the door had already closed. She stood still for a long moment, then slowly looked back at the sleeping boy. And for the first time, uncertainty began to settle inside her, not as fear, but as confusion. The Alpha King returned. When the light outside had begun to soften, not dramatically, not announced, simply present again, he entered the room quietly. The boy was still asleep. She was still standing, and the space between them shifted immediately, not through action, but through awareness. He looked at his son first, then at her. You did not leave, he said. It was not accusation, just observation. I was told to stay, she replied. A pause. That was not an order, he said. I did not take it as one. She answered honestly. Something subtle moved in his expression at that. He stepped slightly closer, not invading space, but closing distance enough to observe more clearly. You have not asked anything since you arrived, he said. I do not know what to ask, she admitted. That seemed to pause him, as if that answer carried more truth than expected. The boy shifted slightly in his sleep. Both of them looked toward him at the same time. That shared reaction created something unspoken between them. Then, silence returned. The Alpha King spoke again, softer. He rarely speaks to anyone like this. She looked at him. I did not do anything special, she said. His gaze lingered on her for a moment longer. That is exactly what concerns me, he replied quietly. Her breath caught slightly, but he did not elaborate immediately. Instead, he turned slightly, as if choosing his words carefully. Tell me what happened before I arrived, he said. She hesitated, then slowly spoke. He came to me in the healing quarters, she said. He asked me a question. I thought it was childish, harmless. She paused slightly, then continued. He asked if I would marry him. A faint stillness moved through the air again, not shock, not reaction, but attention sharpening. The Alpha King did not interrupt, so she continued. I did not understand the seriousness, she said softly. I answered gently. I thought it was a child's way of expressing loneliness. Silence followed. Then she added, quieter. I did not think it meant anything beyond comfort. The Alpha King exhaled slowly, not frustration, not anger, understanding forming. He was not speaking without intent. He said finally, "I realize that now," she replied. Another pause. Then he looked at her again. "Do you know what he is?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "Your son?" A faint shift in his gaze. "Yes," he agreed. But not only that. That sentence made her still slightly. He continued, "He is protected because the world does not treat his presence lightly." She listened carefully now. "And yet," he added, "he approached you alone." That detail lingered between them. Alone, the word carried more weight than it should have. She looked down slightly. "I did not call him," she said quietly. "I know," he repeated again. That repetition was becoming familiar, unsettlingly so, because it meant he believed her. Without hesitation, the boy stirred again, this time waking slightly. His eyes opened slowly, then immediately found her, as if she had been the first thing his awareness searched for. "Are you still here?" he asked softly. "Yes," she replied. He seemed satisfied by that answer, then looked toward the Alpha King. "I told her to stay," he said. A faint stillness passed through the Alpha King's expression again. Then he nodded once. "I know." The boy smiled slightly and settled back, as if the conversation had ended in exactly the way he expected. The Alpha King turned back to her. "This will not remain unnoticed," he said quietly. Her stomach tightened slightly. "What will happen?" she asked. "I do not yet decide based on assumption," he replied. A pause. Then softer, "But I will understand why he chose you." That sentence lingered in the room long after it was spoken. Not threatening, not comforting, simply inevitable. Outside, the wind shifted again, as if the world itself was waiting to see what meaning would be assigned to this moment. And she who had spent her life being unseen found herself standing in the center of something she had never asked to enter. Not rejection, not acceptance, but something far more uncertain. Being noticed by the Alpha King, and by a child who believed she was someone worth staying with. She did not sleep that night, not because she was afraid, but because her mind had not yet learned how to settle inside a place where she was being quietly observed instead of ignored. The room remained still around her, softened by dim light that came through the high window. The boy had fallen asleep again after waking briefly, as if his body trusted the world enough now to let go completely. That trust should have felt simple. It did not. It felt unfamiliar, heavy in a way she could not yet name. She sat near the edge of the room, hands folded loosely in her lap, trying not to take up more space than she believed she was allowed to occupy. Outside, the settlement had quieted, but it was not the same quiet she knew. This silence was not absence, it was awareness, as if something large had passed through, and the world was still remembering how to breathe normally again. And she was at the center of that memory. The Alpha King returned just before dawn. She felt him before she saw him, not through sound, but through presence. The air changed slightly, like it always did around him, becoming more deliberate, more contained, as if even space respected his rival. He did not enter quickly. He never did. When he stepped inside, he first looked at his son. A long, steady glance, not checking, not doubting, simply confirming that he was there, safe. Then his gaze moved to her, and stayed longer than before, not in a way that made her feel small, but in a way that made her feel noticed without preparation. "You have not left," he said again. It was the second time he had said it, and each time it felt less like observation and more like understanding something about her that she had never said aloud. "I was told to stay." She replied softly. A faint pause. That instruction was not meant to bind you, he said. I understood, she answered honestly. He studied her for a moment longer, then stepped further inside, not invading space, but no longer keeping distance either. There was something different in him today, not in strength, not in presence, but in attention, as if something had shifted his focus from the world at large to her specifically. The boy stirred slightly but did not wake. The Alpha King lowered his voice. Tell me again, he said quietly. What did he say to you when he first arrived? She hesitated, then repeated it. He asked me to marry him. She expected the same reaction as before, silence, observation, analysis. But this time, something else followed. A very slight narrowing of his gaze. Not anger, not disbelief. Something more precise, understanding sharpening. He did not use those words. Without meaning, he said finally, I realize that now, she replied. A pause. Then he asked something different. Did you feel fear when he spoke to you? The question surprised her. She thought about it carefully. No, she said, another pause. Then softer, I felt confused. He nodded once, as if that answer mattered more than she understood. The silence between them grew again, but it was no longer empty, it was layered, measured. The kind of silence that happens when two people are standing on the edge of something neither has named yet. Then the boy moved, slowly waking. His eyes opened and immediately found her again, as if she were the first constant in a world that had not yet taught him what permanence felt like. Are you still here? He asked again. Yes, she answered softly. He seemed satisfied again, then turned slightly toward his father. I told her to stay, he said, as if repeating something important. The Alpha King looked at him, and something subtle shifted in his expression, not correction, not approval, recognition, double quotes. Yes, he said quietly. You did. The boy smiled faintly and relaxed again, as if that was all he needed to hear. She watched this exchange silently, and for the first time, something unfamiliar stirred in her chest, not belonging, not fear, but something in between, like being near a door she had never been invited to see before. The Alpha King turned back to her. I will not ask you to explain yourself further tonight, he said. The words surprised her slightly. I did not think I was being questioned, she replied softly. A faint pause. Then his gaze held hers a little longer. You are not accustomed to being included in decisions that involve you, he said. The sentence landed quietly, but deeply, because it was true. She did not answer, because she could not deny it without sounding like she was arguing with her own life. He stepped slightly closer again, stopping at a respectful distance. There is something I must understand, he said. She nodded slightly. What is it? His eyes shifted briefly to his son, then back to her. Why he chose you? That question was not demanding, it was not accusing, it was simply important. She felt the weight of it immediately. I did not influence his choice, she said quietly. I only responded when he spoke. That, he said softly, is what I am observing. Silence followed again. This time, longer, not uncomfortable, but deeply attentive. The Alpha King seemed to be listening to something that was not being spoken aloud. Then he said something unexpected. You are not afraid of him. She blinked slightly. I have no reason to be, she replied. A faint shift in his gaze. That is not the usual answer, he said. She looked down briefly. I do not think I am important enough to fear someone like him, she said honestly. The words left her mouth without intention, but they lingered in the air afterward in a way that felt heavier than she expected. The Alpha King did not respond immediately. Instead, he studied her with a quiet stillness that made her realize something unsettling. He was not just hearing her words. He was hearing the belief underneath them. Finally, he spoke. That belief is incorrect. Simple, direct, not harsh, but absolute. She looked at him again. For a moment, she did not know how to respond to that kind of certainty. The boy shifted again, this time turning slightly toward her as if unconsciously anchoring himself closer to her presence. The Alpha King noticed. Of course he did. His gaze softened slightly at that movement. Then he said, quieter, "He does not approach those he feels uncertain around." That sentence changed something in the air. She felt it immediately. Not fear, but awareness deepening. The Alpha King continued, "And he did not hesitate with you." Silence. Then he added, carefully, "That is not normal." She felt her breath slow slightly. "I did not do anything," she said again. "I know," he replied once more. But this time, the repetition felt heavier because now it was no longer just acknowledgement, it was investigation. He stepped slightly to the side, as if thinking, not pacing, not restless, just considering. Then he spoke again. "There are individuals in this world who carry recognition without awareness of it." She listened carefully. "I have seen it rarely," he continued. "But when it appears," he paused, then looked at her directly again. "It changes the way others respond to them without explanation." Her fingers tightened slightly in her lap. "I am not such a person," she said quietly. He did not agree, but he did not disagree either. Instead, he said, "That is what I intend to determine." A silence followed, not threatening, but deeply focused. The kind of silence that comes before something irreversible is understood. The boy stirred again, mumbling slightly in his sleep. Both of them looked at him at the same time. That shared reaction lingered between them, then faded. The Alpha King spoke more softly now. "For tonight," he said, "you remain here." She nodded slightly. "And after tonight?" she asked before she could stop herself. A pause. Then he answered honestly, "After tonight depends on what I learn." That was not a threat. It was a truth spoken before it had fully formed. He turned slightly toward the door, but stopped before leaving. Without looking back fully, he said, "He does not form attachments without reason." Then he left, quietly as he always did. The room felt different after he was gone. Not emptier, but quieter in a way that felt more personal. She sat still for a long time, listening to the boy's steady breathing, and to the silence that now felt like it belonged to something larger than her life had ever contained. Outside, the wind moved gently again, as if the world had not finished deciding what she was yet. And for the first time in a long time, she realized she was no longer invisible. The morning light did not feel like morning anymore. It felt like something had changed in the way it entered the room, softer, slower, almost hesitant, as if even the sun was now aware that something important existed inside this quiet space. She had not slept deeply, not because of fear, but because her mind had begun to understand a dangerous new feeling. Being seen, not briefly, not accidentally, but continuously. The boy was already awake, sitting near the window again, knees drawn slightly closer to his chest, watching her in that calm, steady way he always did. There was something unusual about the way he stayed near her without asking permission, as if her presence had become a place he naturally returned to. She noticed it now in small details. How he adjusted his position when she moved. How his eyes followed her without strain. How silence between them no longer felt empty, it felt shared. She prepared a small cloth basin with warm water and herbs out of habit, then paused slightly, realizing there was no official task requiring her to do so. But she continued anyway, because stopping felt more unfamiliar than continuing. The boy tilted his head slightly. "You always help," he said softly. She glanced at him gently. "It is what I know how to do." He considered that, then said something that lingered longer than it should have. "Do you help because people ask you, or because you want to?" The question surprised her, not because it was complex, but because it was simple in a way she had stopped expecting. She paused for a moment before answering. "I don't think people usually wait long enough to ask," she said quietly. The boy nodded, slowly, as if this confirmed something he had already suspected. Outside, footsteps approached. Not rushed, not chaotic. Controlled, familiar now in a way she was still adjusting to. The Alpha King entered as always. The room subtly changed when he did. Not louder, not sharper. Just more aware. He did not speak immediately. First, he looked at his son, a steady glance, then at her, longer than before, but still without pressure. "You are awake," he said to the boy. The boy nodded. She stayed. The Alpha King's gaze shifted slightly. "I see that," he replied softly. There was a pause. Then he stepped further inside. Not closer in distance, but closer in attention. "You have been here longer than expected," he said. To her, she understood the meaning beneath it. Not dismissal, not restriction, but acknowledgement that time was now part of the equation. "I did not intend to remain long," she said honestly. "And yet you did," he replied. She did not argue, because it was true. The boy stood up and walked closer to her, then stopped beside her without hesitation. The Alpha King noticed that movement, as he always did. But this time, something shifted slightly in his expression, not surprise, not concern. Something more thoughtful. "You have become comfortable near her," he said to his son. The boy nodded. Yes, a simple answer, but it carried weight. The Alpha King looked at her again, longer this time, as if measuring something that did not present itself physically. Then he spoke more softly. "You have not tried to redirect his attachment." She blinked slightly. "I did not think I should," she replied. A pause. "Why?" he asked. She hesitated, then answered honestly. "Because he is not harming anyone." Silence. Not tense, but thoughtful again. The Alpha King studied her reaction carefully, then said, "Most would treat this differently." "I am not most people," she said quietly. That sentence made something flicker briefly in his gaze. Not approval, not disagreement. Recognition. The boy tugged gently at her sleeve again. A familiar gesture now. Not desperate, just present. She looked down at him. "What is it?" she asked softly. He hesitated, then said, "When you said yes, did you mean it?" The question landed differently than before, because now she understood what he was actually asking. Not marriage, not ritual, but presence. She crouched slightly again to meet his eyes. "I meant it in the way I understood it at that moment," she said gently. "I did not want you to feel alone." He nodded slowly, as if accepting this answer without needing more. The Alpha King watched this exchange silently, then said, quietly, "That is not an insignificant response." She straightened slightly. "I did not think it was significant at All, she admitted. That, he replied, is becoming clear. A pause. Then he stepped slightly aside, as if deciding something internally. You will remain here today, he said. She did not respond immediately, then asked carefully, Is that still instruction or observation? A faint shift in his expression. Both, he answered honestly. The boy smiled faintly at that, as if satisfied by the structure of it. And then something unexpected happened. He reached up and held her hand properly. Not the sleeve this time, but her hand. It was small, warm, certain, and it changed the atmosphere in a way none of them spoke about. The Alpha King noticed. Of course he did, but he did not interrupt it. Instead, he watched silently, and in that silence, something deeper began to take shape. Not yet understood, but undeniably present. Later, the elder healer arrived. He entered with the calmness of someone who already knew more than he was saying. His eyes first went to the boy, then to the Alpha King, then finally to her, and lingered. I see the situation remains unchanged, the elder said softly. The Alpha King responded without turning fully. It is not unchanged. That made the elder pause slightly. Then he looked at her more directly. You are still here, he said gently. I was not asked to leave, she replied. A faint, almost knowing expression crossed the elder's face. That is not usually how decisions around him work, he said. The Alpha King stepped slightly forward. She is not bound by assumption, he said. The elder nodded slowly, as if this was both expected and concerning at the same time. Then he spoke carefully. There are patterns forming. The Alpha King looked at him. Yes, he said simply. The elder continued. The child does not behave unpredictably without cause. A pause. And neither do you observe without reason. The room grew quieter again. The boy did not release her hand. She did not pull away. The Alpha King's gaze moved briefly to that connection again, then back to her, and something in his expression deepened slightly. Not emotion, not reaction, but awareness becoming more structured. You have not attempted to influence him, he said again. I told you before, she replied softly. I did not intend anything. He nodded once. I know, but this time, the repetition felt different, because it was no longer about belief. It was about confirmation of something he was slowly building understanding around. The elder spoke again, more quietly now. If he remains attached, it will not remain private. The Alpha King did not deny it. I am aware, he said. She looked between them now, feeling something shift. Not danger, not safety, but consequence. The boy leaned slightly closer to her and said softly, as if it were the most natural thing in the world, You can stay here. The words were simple, but the way he said them made them feel like a decision that belonged to more than just him. The Alpha King heard it and did not correct him. Instead, he simply looked at her and for the first time, asked something not rooted in observation. What do you want? The question was quiet, but it changed the air immediately, because no one had asked her that before in a way that carried actual weight, not as instruction, not as assumption, but as choice. She looked at the boy, then at the Alpha King, then at the space she had come from, a life of being unseen. And for the first time, she hesitated not because she lacked an answer, but because she had never been allowed to consider one before. And somewhere in that hesitation, something new quietly began. The question did not leave the room. It stayed, not in sound, but in the way silence changed shape after it was spoken. "What do you want?" The Alpha King had asked it simply, without pressure, without expectation. But in her life, simplicity had never meant ease. It meant unfamiliar ground. She stood still for a long moment, as if the air itself had become something she needed to learn how to breathe differently. No one had ever asked her that before in a way that felt real. Not her family, not her settlement, not even the life she had lived before she learned how to become invisible. Because invisible people were rarely asked what they wanted. They were only told what was needed from them. The boy still held her hand, small, warm, and certain. That single touch made the question feel even more real than the voice that spoke it. She looked down at him first. He looked back at her without hesitation, as if her answer was not something he feared, but something he trusted would exist. Then she looked at the Alpha King. He was not standing closer than before, but somehow his presence felt more open now, less like a force moving through space, more like someone waiting within it. The silence stretched, not uncomfortable, but full. She exhaled slowly. "I do not know what I want," she said quietly. The words felt honest, in a way that almost surprised her as she spoke them. Not weakness, just truth without structure. The boy did not look disappointed. The Alpha King did not react immediately. Instead, he studied her expression carefully, as if listening not only to what she said, but to everything she had never been allowed to say before. "That," he said finally, softly, "is also an answer." She looked at him slightly, not expecting that. He continued, "You have lived long enough without being asked that question for it to feel unfamiliar." Something in her chest tightened quietly at that, because he had not judged it. He had simply understood it. The elder healer, standing near the edge of the room, spoke gently. "Understanding what you want does not come from one moment," he said. "It comes from being allowed to exist long enough to hear yourself." Silence followed again. The boy leaned slightly closer to her, as if anchoring himself to her presence without needing explanation. The Alpha King observed that movement, and then spoke. "You are not required to decide anything immediately." That sentence loosened something inside her she had not realized was held so tightly. Not freedom, not commitment, but permission. The permission to not be certain. For the first time, that felt like something real. She slowly lowered herself slightly, so she was closer to the boy's height again. "You are safe here," she said softly to him. He nodded once, as if he had already known that. Then, after a moment, he said something that shifted the air again. "You said yes." Her breath paused slightly. "Yes," she confirmed gently. The boy considered that, then looked at the Alpha King. "I want her to stay," he said simply. No demand, no command, just desire spoken plainly. The Alpha King did not correct him. Instead, his gaze moved back to her, and this time, it lingered longer than before. Not evaluating, not analyzing, but deciding how to understand what was forming in front of him. The elder healer spoke again, quieter this time. "Attachment has already formed," he said, "whether or not it is acknowledged." The Alpha King nodded once. "I see that." Then, he looked at her more directly. "And you have not rejected it." She hesitated, then answered honestly, "I did not feel it needed rejection." A pause. Then softer. "It did not feel harmful." Something subtle passed through the Alpha King's expression again. Not approval, not resistance, but recognition deepening further. The room felt still in a different way now, not because something was ending, but because something was being acknowledged, as real enough to continue existing. The boy yawned slightly, still holding her hand. She instinctively adjusted her posture so he could lean against her more comfortably. Without letting go, he did, without hesitation. The Alpha King saw that, and for a brief moment, his gaze softened in a way that was not often visible, not toward her alone, but toward the simple reality unfolding in front of him. Then he spoke. "You will not be returned to your previous position." The words were calm, not harsh, but final in structure. She looked up slightly, not alarmed, but uncertain. "Is that punishment?" she asked quietly. A faint pause. Then he answered honestly, "No." Another pause. Then, softer, "It is observation." She understood then. Her life had changed direction without force, not through punishment, not through reward, but through attention. The most unfamiliar shift of all, the elder healer bowed his head slightly. As expected, he murmured. Nothing around him remained simple for long. The Alpha King ignored that comment. His focus remained on her. "You will remain within my residence for now," he said, "not as obligation, as safety." Safety. That word sounded different coming from him, not control, not restriction, but structure placed around uncertainty. She looked down at the boy again. He had already relaxed further against her side, as if her presence had become something his body trusted before his thoughts did. And she realized something quietly unsettling. He was not pretending. None of this felt like play to him. It felt like certainty. She exhaled slowly. "I do not know how long I should stay," she said honestly. The Alpha King responded without delay. "Long enough for clarity." That answer made sense in a way she did not fully understand yet. The elder healer stepped slightly back. "This is no longer a simple encounter," he said softly. "It is becoming structure." The Alpha King did not deny it. Instead, he turned slightly toward the door. But before leaving, he spoke once more. "You will not be alone here." The words were simple, but they landed differently now, because they were not spoken as promise. They were spoken as fact. Then he left, as quietly as he always did. The room did not feel emptier after he was gone. It felt steadier. The boy adjusted slightly, still holding her hand. She looked at him. "You are comfortable here," she said softly. He nodded. "Yes." Then, after a pause, "You are too." That sentence surprised her more than anything else, because she realized he was right, not fully, not permanently, but enough to notice. The elder healer approached the door again. Before leaving, he looked back at her. "Be careful of one thing," he said gently. She looked at him. "What?" He answered softly. "Being seen after a lifetime of invisibility can feel like safety." A pause. "But it can also feel like belonging before it is understood." Then he left. The room fell into softer silence again. Not empty, not heavy. Just present. The boy yawned once more, then leaned further against her. This time, she did not adjust away. She simply allowed it. And for the first time, she did not feel like she was occupying space where she did not belong. She felt like she was being allowed to remain in it. Outside, the world continued moving. But here, within this quiet structure shaped by presence, observation, and a child's certainty, something unfamiliar had begun to take root. Not fate forced, not bond declared, but something quieter, something chosen without being named. And as she sat there, holding a child's trust in her hand, she realized the most unsettling truth of all. She was no longer waiting to be noticed. She was already inside someone's attention, and it was only the beginning.